For most of human existence, there was an invisible lottery running in every settlement, every city, every empire. Some would survive unmarked. Others would carry scars across their faces for life, craters in the skin where pustules had erupted and healed. Many would not survive at all. This was not tragedy. This was normal. This was the cost of living among other humans. The fever came first, sudden and merciless, climbing until the body burned from within. Then came the rash, red spots emerging across the chest, the face, spreading like wildfire across skin. Within days, these spots transformed into raised bumps, then blisters filled with thick fluid. The pustules covered everything: face, arms, legs, inside the mouth, down the throat. The pain was extraordinary. Victims could not eat, could not drink, could not move without agony. Death arrived in multiple ways. Some victims bled internally, their organs liquefying. Others suffocated as pustules blocked airways. The fortunate ones simply burned out, organs failing from the sustained fever. But death was not the only outcome. Survivors often lost their sight, the virus destroying corneas. Women frequently became infertile, and everyone who lived carried the scars, pockmarks that announced to the world that they had faced the demon and survived. For thousands of years, this cycle repeated endlessly. What humanity did not yet understand was that they were facing an organism that had learned to exploit the very architecture of civilization itself. The moment populations grew large enough to sustain it, dense enough to spread it, mobile enough to carry it across continents, the virus became permanent. It was not a visitor, it was a resident. The origins remain imprecise, but the mechanism is cleared. Variola virus, a brick-shaped strand of DNA wrapped in protein, likely jumped from rodents to humans somewhere in East Africa or India between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. It required a threshold. Villages of a few hundred could not sustain it. The virus would burn through, kill or immunize the survivors, and vanish. But when populations reached critical mass, roughly 200,000 people concentrated in a region, the mathematics changed. There were always enough new births, enough susceptible hosts, for the virus to circulate endlessly. The first physical evidence comes not from chronicles but from preserved flesh. The mummified body of Ramses V, who ruled Egypt around 1157 BCE, bears unmistakable pockmarks across the face, neck, and chest. The pustular scars are frozen in desiccated tissue, proof that this scourge had already embedded itself in the ancient world. From the Nile Valley, it spread along the arteries of trade and empire. By the 2nd century CE, it had reached the heart of Rome. In 165 CE, a pestilence swept through the empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a pandemic so severe it would later be named for him. The Antonine Plague arrived with Roman legions returning from Mesopotamia, soldiers who had besieged the city of Seleucia on the Tigris. They brought back more than victory. The Greek physician Galen, personal doctor to the emperors, described the symptoms with clinical precision. First came the fever, sudden and high, accompanied by violent thirst and diarrhea. Days later, a rash appeared, starting as red spots before transforming into black pustules that covered the body. The sores crusted over, leaving deep scars on those who survived. The stench of rotting flesh filled the streets. For 15 years, the disease ravaged every corner of the empire. Contemporary sources claim 2,000 people died daily in Rome at the pandemic's peak. Modern historians estimate between 5 and 10 million deaths, roughly 10% of the empire's entire population. The professional army dissolved as entire legions were decimated. Fields went untended, the machinery of imperial administration ground to a halt. The empire's most educated minds had no framework to comprehend what was destroying them. They believed corrupted air, miasma, carried the disease. They blamed a specific alignment of planets in the heavens that had released poisonous vapors from the earth. They burned aromatic woods and incense to purify the atmosphere. They bled patients already weakened by fever, draining what little strength remained. They applied poultices of herbs and animal dung to the pustules, often introducing secondary infections. Nothing worked. The treatments killed as efficiently as the disease. The empire survived, but it never fully recovered. The Golden Age of Rome ended not with barbarian invasions, but with invisible biology that rewrote the demographic map of the Mediterranean. For centuries after, the virus circulated quietly through the connected regions of Eurasia, Africa, and the Middle East. It killed, it disfigured, it blinded. In 735 CE, a ship from the Korean kingdom of Silla docked at the Japanese port of Dazaifu on the island of Kyushu. Someone aboard was sick. Within weeks, the disease had spread inland, carried by merchants and officials traveling the newly constructed roads that connected the port to the interior. Japan had never encountered this pathogen before. The population had no immunity, no resistance, no cultural memory of how to respond. The mortality was catastrophic. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1/4 and 1/3 of Japan's entire population died within 3 years. In some regions, entire villages vanished. The fields went to seed, the tax registers recorded settlement after settlement with no living inhabitants. The political structure of the state collapsed. The 4 most powerful nobles of the Fujiwara clan, brothers who controlled the government as regents, all died within months of each other in 737. The imperial court was paralyzed. The Nara period's grand project of building a centralized state modeled on Tang China ground to a halt. The virus had decapitated the government more efficiently than any rebellion. The Japanese had no framework to understand what was happening. They believed the disease was divine punishment, the wrath of gods angered by the construction of Buddhist temples or the adoption of foreign customs. The emperor issued decrees ordering the construction of more temples, the copying of sacred texts, the performance of purification rituals. Monks chanted sutras continuously. None of it mattered. The virus followed its own logic, indifferent to prayer. By 740, the epidemic had burned itself out, having killed or immunized most of the susceptible population. Japan emerged transformed. Smallpox outbreaks swept through Japan repeatedly over the following centuries, each time killing those born since the last visitation, maintaining its grip on the population through cycles of death and immunity. But the most devastating collision between the virus and a virgin population occurred not in Asia, but across the Pacific, in a world that had been biologically isolated for over 10,000 years. The Americas had no smallpox. They had no measles, no typhus, no plague. The indigenous populations had lived in a disease environment so different from Eurasia that their immune systems were calibrated for entirely different threats. When European ships arrived carrying not just men and weapons, but invisible passengers, the result was demographic collapse on a scale never seen before or since. The apocalypse began not with conquest, but with a single infected individual. In 1519, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with roughly 600 men, a handful of horses, and a few small cannons. He marched inland toward the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city of over 200,000 people built on islands in the middle of a vast lake, connected to the mainland by causeways. The Aztec Empire was at its height, controlling millions of people across central Mexico through a sophisticated system of tribute and military dominance. The Spanish were hopelessly outnumbed. Their initial assault on the city in June 1520 was a disaster. The Aztecs drove them out in a chaotic night retreat known as the Noche Triste, killing hundreds of Spaniards and their indigenous allies. Cortés retreated to the countryside to regroup, seemingly defeated. But while the Spanish regrouped, something else entered Tenochtitlan. An enslaved African man in Cortés's expedition, whose name is lost to history, was sick with smallpox. Before the Spanish retreat, he had contact with the Aztec population. The virus found its new host. Within days, the first cases appeared in the city. Within weeks, it was spreading exponentially through the densely packed urban center. The Aztecs had no name for this disease. They called it Huiahuizotl, the Great Leprosy, because of the pustules that covered victims' bodies. The death toll was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Tenochtitlan's population died within months. The city's infrastructure collapsed. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be removed. The canals became clogged with corpses. The Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had led the successful defense against the Spanish just months earlier, died of the disease in December 1520, having ruled for only 80 days. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, inherited a dying city. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical death toll. The Aztecs believed the disease was a divine punishment sent by the gods to favor the Spanish invaders. Why else would the strangers remain healthy while the Aztecs died in massive numbers? The Spanish, many of whom had survived smallpox in childhood and carried immunity, seemed protected by supernatural power. This perception shattered Aztec morale and religious certainty. How could their gods allow this thing? How could the cosmic order permit such suffering? When Cortés returned to lay siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521, he faced not the mighty empire that had defeated him the year before, but a broken, diseased, starving population. The siege lasted 3 months. The Aztecs fought desperately, but they were fighting on 2 fronts, against Spanish weapons and against invisible biology. When the city finally fell in August 1521, the Spanish walked into a necropolis. The stench of death was overwhelming. Survivors were emaciated, faces marked with scars. The conquest was complete, but the virus had done more than Spanish steel ever could. Without smallpox, Cortés's tiny force would likely have been annihilated. With it, an empire fell. The virus did not stop at Tenochtitlan. It radiated outward through the networks of trade and tribute that connected the Aztec Empire to the rest of Mesoamerica. It traveled south through Guatemala, killing Mayan populations. It moved north into what is now the southwestern United States. And it continued south, somehow crossing the Isthmus of Panama, possibly carried by indigenous traders or fleeing refugees, moving faster than the Spanish conquistadors themselves. By the mid-1520s, it had reached the Andes. The Inca Empire, the largest state in the pre-Columbian Americas, stretching along the western coast of South America, was struck before a single Spanish soldier had set foot in the region. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac was campaigning in the northern part of his empire, in what is now Ecuador, when the disease arrived around 1527. He fell ill along with his designated heir, and both died within days of each other. The sudden death of the emperor and his successor threw the empire into chaos. A civil war erupted between 2 surviving sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, each claiming the throne. The war raged for 5 years, devastating the empire's military and administrative capacity, killing tens of thousands of soldiers, and fracturing the unity of the state. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532 with fewer than 200 men, he walked into an empire that had been gutted from within by disease and civil war. The pattern repeated across the Americas. Smallpox moved through indigenous populations like fire through dry grass, often arriving years or even decades before European colonists reached a region. The demographic collapse was so severe that modern historians estimate the indigenous population of the Americas may have declined by 90% or more within a century of contact. Entire civilizations vanished. Languages died. Agricultural systems that had sustained millions for centuries were abandoned. The forests of the eastern United States, which early European settlers described as pristine wilderness, were actually secondary growth, reclaiming land that had been farmed for generations before the populations collapsed. The Americas were not an empty Eden waiting to be settled. They were a graveyard. Back in the Old World, populations that had lived with smallpox for millennia had developed not immunity, but coping mechanisms. In China, physicians had noticed a pattern. Those who survived smallpox never contracted it again. This observation, made over centuries of careful record-keeping, led to a radical intervention. By the 10th century, Chinese physicians were practicing variolation, the deliberate infection of healthy people with material from smallpox pustules. The technique was simple but dangerous. Scabs from a mild smallpox case were ground into powder and blown into the nostrils of a healthy child. The hope was that the child would develop a mild case, survive, and gain lifelong immunity. It worked, sometimes. The mortality rate from variolation was roughly 1 to 2%, far lower than the 10 to 30% mortality of naturally acquired smallpox. but it was still a gamble. The practice spread slowly westward. By the 17th century, it had reached the Ottoman Empire, where it was widely practiced among the elite. European travelers observed the technique with a mixture of fascination and horror. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of the British ambassador to Constantinople, had her own children variolated in the 1720s after witnessing the practice in Turkey. She became an advocate for the procedure in England, but faced fierce resistance. The medical establishment was skeptical. The church argued that it was against God's will to deliberately infect the healthy, and there were real risks. Variolation sometimes caused severe disease. Worse, it created infectious individuals who could spread smallpox to others, occasionally triggering small epidemics. But the mathematics were compelling. In a world where smallpox was endemic, where most people would encounter the virus eventually, variolation offered a way to control the terms of that encounter. European aristocrats began to adopt the practice. By the mid-18th century, variolation was relatively common among the wealthy, though it remained controversial and never reached the general population. The procedure was expensive, required medical supervision, and carried that unavoidable risk. What was needed was not a better way to infect people with smallpox, but a way to protect them without using the deadly virus at all. The breakthrough came from the English countryside, from a place where humans and animals lived in close proximity. Dairy farmers had long observed that milkmaids, who often contracted a mild disease called cowpox from handling infected cows, seemed never to catch smallpox. Cowpox caused a few pustules on the hands, a brief fever, and then disappeared, leaving only small scars. But those scars appeared to confer protection against the far deadlier smallpox. In 1796, a country doctor named Edward Jenner decided to test this folk wisdom with a deliberate experiment. He took material from a cowpox pustule on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelmis and inserted it into cuts on the arm of an 8-year-old boy, James Phipps. The boy developed a mild cowpox infection and recovered. 6 weeks later, Jenner did something that would be considered deeply unethical today. He variolated the boy with actual smallpox, deliberately exposing him to the deadly virus. The boy did not develop smallpox. He was immune. Jenner had demonstrated that exposure to cowpox could protect against smallpox without the risks of variolation. He called the procedure vaccination, from the Latin word for cow, vacca. It was a revolution in preventive medicine, the first vaccine. But like all revolutions, it faced resistance. The medical establishment demanded more evidence. Religious leaders argued that it was blasphemous to inject people with material from animals. Satirical cartoons depicted vaccinated people sprouting cow horns and udders. But the evidence was overwhelming. Vaccination worked. It was safer than variolation, it did not create infectious individuals who could spread smallpox, and it could be performed on a massive scale. By the early 19th century, vaccination campaigns were underway across Europe and the Americas. Governments began to mandate vaccination, recognizing that individual immunity created collective protection. For over a century after Jenner's discovery, smallpox continued to kill millions, particularly in regions with limited access to vaccination or weak public health systems. In the early 20th century, smallpox was still endemic in much of Asia, Africa, and South America. Outbreaks occurred regularly in Europe and North America despite vaccination programs. The virus was too entrenched, too widespread, too adaptable to local conditions. It existed in two forms, variola major, which killed up to 30% of those infected, and variola minor, which killed closer to 1%. Both strains circulated simultaneously, complicating efforts to track and contain outbreaks. The turning point came in 1967 when the World Health Organization launched the Intensified Smallpox Eradication Program. The goal was audacious: eliminate smallpox from every country on Earth. The strategy was based on surveillance and containment. Health workers would track every case, vaccinate everyone in the surrounding area to create a ring of immunity, and starve the virus of hosts. Somalia reported its last case of naturally occurring smallpox in October 1977. The patient was a hospital cook named Ali Mao Ma'alin. He survived. After him, no one else on Earth contracted smallpox from another human being, The virus had been cornered, isolated, and extinguished in the wild. On May 8, 1980, the World Health Assembly declared smallpox eradicated, the first and still only human disease to be completely eliminated through deliberate intervention. The announcement was met with cautious celebration. The samples of the virus that remained in laboratories became the subject of intense debate. Should they be destroyed, eliminating the last reservoirs of one of humanity's oldest enemies? Or should they be preserved for research, in case the virus somehow returned or similar pathogens emerged? The victory over smallpox was not just medical, it was civilizational. For the first time in recorded history, humans had identified a fundamental threat to their survival and systematically removed it from the planet. The children born after 1980 would never know the fear that had haunted every previous generation. They would never see the pustules. They would never carry the scars. The samples remain in laboratories in the United States and Russia, frozen in liquid nitrogen, waiting. The vaccine is no longer given routinely, which means that most people born after 1980 have no immunity. If the virus were ever released, deliberately or accidentally, it would find a world as vulnerable as the Americas in 1520.